It started innocently enough, as most things like this do. We moved into the house at the beginning of summer, me, my mom, and my little sister, Ellie. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small house on the outskirts of town. It was old, but cozy, with a big backyard and a swing set that Ellie loved. My mom said it was a fresh start for all of us after the divorce, and for a while, it felt like it could be. At first, things were fine. Ellie would spend hours outside, playing on the swing or chasing bugs, while I holed up in my room trying to ignore the weird noises that old houses make. Creaks and groans, the occasional bang from the pipes, nothing unusual for a house that had been standing for decades. But then, Ellie started talking about her new friend. "Sarah plays with me," she said one night at dinner, her mouth full of spaghetti. My mom smiled, amused. "Who's Sarah?" Ellie shrugged, swinging her legs under the table. "She lives in the house. She likes to play on the swings." I rolled my eyes. "You've been talking to ghosts again?" I teased, poking at my plate. Ellie stuck her tongue out at me. "She's not a ghost, stupid." Mom chuckled and told Ellie not to talk with her mouth full, and that was that. We all figured it was just an imaginary friend, a kid's way of adjusting to a new place. I didn't think much of it at the time. But after that night, things started getting weird. It was little things at first. I'd hear Ellie giggling in her room, talking to someone when no one was there. When I'd ask her what she was doing, she'd just shrug and say, "Playing with Sarah." I brushed it off as typical kid stuff. But then there were the nights when I'd wake up to the sound of the swings creaking outside, even though the air was still. One night, I woke up around midnight, thirsty as hell. As I headed to the kitchen for water, I glanced out the window into the backyard. The swings were moving, back and forth, slowly, like someone had just gotten off them. My heart skipped a beat, but I told myself it was just the wind, even though the trees were still and the air was heavy with the summer heat. That's when I saw her. There was a figure standing near the swing set, barely visible in the faint moonlight. She was small, around Ellie's size, with long dark hair hanging limp around her shoulders. She stood motionless, just watching the swings. My stomach dropped. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was seeing things, but when I looked again, she was still there, her head slowly turning toward the house. Toward me. I froze, unable to move as her eyes, dark, empty, locked onto mine. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at her. It felt like hours, though it was probably just a few seconds. But then, without warning, she turned and walked back toward the woods at the edge of our yard, disappearing into the shadows. The next morning, I told my mom what I'd seen. She smiled, clearly not taking me seriously, and said it was probably just my imagination, or maybe a neighbor's kid playing late at night. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't some neighborhood kid. Things escalated after that. Ellie started changing. She used to be this bright, happy little girl, always running around and laughing. But she grew quieter, more withdrawn. She'd spend hours sitting by the window, staring out into the backyard, waiting. And when she wasn't watching the swings, she was talking to Sarah. "She doesn't like you," Ellie told me one day, her voice flat and emotionless. I blinked. "Who doesn't?" "Sarah." Ellie's eyes were distant, her face pale. "She says you're mean." I laughed it off, trying to ignore the icy feeling creeping up my spine. "Tell Sarah to mind her own business." Ellie didn't laugh. She just stared at me with those cold, empty eyes, the same eyes I'd seen on the girl in the backyard. I shivered and walked away, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease that had settled over the house. The final straw came one night about a week later. It was late, well past midnight, and I woke up to the sound of Ellie's voice coming from the hallway. At first, I thought she was talking to Mom, but when I got out of bed and opened my door, I saw her standing in the dark, facing the wall, whispering to someone I couldn't see. "Ellie?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. She just kept whispering, her voice low and urgent. I stepped closer. "Ellie, what are you doing?" She turned around slowly, her face pale, her eyes wide and vacant. "She says you have to go," she whispered. "She doesn't want you here." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Who? Sarah?" Ellie nodded, her expression unreadable. "She says she lives here now. You don't belong." Before I could respond, the temperature in the hallway dropped. I could see my breath, feel the chill settling into my bones. And then, from behind Ellie, I saw movement. Sarah. She stepped out of the shadows, her face twisted into a horrible smile, her eyes gleaming with malice. She looked just like the girl I'd seen in the yard, small, fragile, but wrong. Her skin was too pale, her limbs too stiff, like she was barely holding herself together. I stumbled back, my heart pounding, as Sarah reached out toward Ellie, her fingers long and sharp. "You don't belong here," she whispered, her voice cold and hollow. I screamed for my mom, but by the time she came running, Sarah was gone. Ellie was standing there, looking confused, like she didn't remember anything. Mom didn't believe me. She thought I'd had a nightmare. But I know what I saw. And I know that whatever Sarah was, she's still out there, waiting. The next morning, we found the swing set broken, the chains snapped like someone, or something, had yanked them apart with unnatural strength. Ellie hasn't mentioned Sarah since that night. She's back to her old self, laughing and playing, like none of it ever happened. But sometimes, at night, I still hear the creaking of the swings. I look out the window, and there's no one there. At least, not that I can see.